When the Second World War broke out, the idea of a shoulder-fired anti-tank launcher didn't even exist. Yet by the end, well over 10 million had been produced in just a few short years. Early versions, however, were anything but safe or reliable, and plenty of men paid with their lives for the hard lessons to be learned. So here's the turbulent and quite strange journey of the handheld anti-tank weapons of the Second World War. When the war began in 1939, tanks were still nothing more than guns on tracks with enough armor to stop machine gun fire, sometimes not even that. So, more or less, the same type of weapons that could defeat World War I armor were basically still in use and still effective. Those were mostly anti-tank rifles and smaller caliber towed anti-tank guns, but over the course of a few short years, tanks would be developed beyond recognition, and logically, weapons to counter them needed to follow as well. So, why was there a shift toward what would later become known as rocket-propelled grenades? Anti-tank rifles were essentially heavy, oversized, standard infantry rifles with special armor-piercing ammunition. They were sufficient enough to knock out early tanks, but they very quickly became obsolete. Soviet anti-tank rifles, for example, were still quite dangerous even to later tanks like the Panther if they hit a weak spot from the side or roof at close distance. Their 14.5 caliber armor-piercing round was a mean one, and it forced the Germans to mount these improvised side skirts on their tanks on the Eastern Front. The skirts would tumble the round and slow it enough so it wouldn't go through the main armor, but they also came in handy for prematurely detonating shaped charges when they met the Western Allies and their weapons. So, with anti-tank rifles soon ineffective as ever thicker armor began arriving, the focus went more onto towed anti-tank guns, but even more onto shaped charge type weapons. Towed guns were expensive, heavy, needed a whole team to operate, couldn't be everywhere at the same time, and you surely couldn't fire one through a window from your shoulder in close urban engagements. So the focus went to developing a portable light anti-tank weapon that infantry could carry with them, but one more capable than rifles. The most promising concept was the shaped charge, so let's first briefly explain what it was. A shaped charge is designed so that upon contact with enemy armor, the fuse would activate the charge, which was specifically built to focus its explosive energy into basically a jet of liquid. An incredibly hot metal that would cut through the armor and splatter inside the tank onto the crew, ammunition and fuel, in most cases making the tank no longer capable of fighting, to say the least. Many countries were quite successful at designing a shaped charge warhead, and they proved very effective even against thicker armor. However, the problem was how to deliver that shaped charge warhead accurately to the enemy tank. From there, we have a couple of different paths of possible solutions, and some are just ridiculous. So let's talk about them, and why not start with the ridiculous ones first, like hand-thrown shaped charges, then we'll move from there. Just a quick note, the title of the video mentioned RPGs, and although rocket-propelled grenade as a term wasn't used in World War II, we put it in the title, so you'd better know what this video is about. We'll also talk about weapons that weren't rocket-propelled, just a quick heads up before you spam the comment section with insults. With that out of the way, let's start with a German creation called the Panzerfaust, or in English, anti-tank mine, but it wasn't a mine as you would think of it. This was intended as a hand-thrown shaped charge. Now, you might think that this was an early design from the beginning of the war, based on how primitive the idea is. But no, it was designed at a time when the Panzerfaust already existed, which was actually quite an effective weapon, and we'll come to it in a moment. So why then this anti-tank football? This was an attempt to make something simpler and cheaper than the already simple and cheap Panzerfaust, and it was actually used throughout the entire war, believe it or not. There isn't much to say about it, a hand-thrown shaped charge with an impact fuse. The soldier, unfortunate enough to have to use it, would have to throw it like a football at an enemy tank, where it needed to land at a 90-degree angle to be effective. But it weighed 3 pounds, so how far could the average person throw it? And look at this, the danger zone of this mine exploding was greater than the throwing range of most people, so it was better if you ducked down in a foxhole before the mine landed. However, having an enemy tank so close to you suggests that you'd have bigger problems than that anyway. Then, to solve the range problem, someone thought to put anti-tank shaped charges onto rifles and fire them this way. But before firing it from a rifle, the Germans, yes, the Germans again, had the idea to take this little flare gun, then put an anti-tank grenade on top of it and fire it with a blank cartridge. It was called the Panzerfaust 42. Okay, it sounds better than throwing it by hand, but the small flare gun wasn't quite the promising solution. As you could imagine, the recoil was quite substantial, so they put a stock on the flare pistol. You wouldn't be getting much range or accuracy either, but the shaped charge was promising and much more effective than anti-tank rifles. Then we have the same principle, but instead of a flare gun, using standard infantry rifles. A shaped charge warhead was fixed with an added extension on the muzzle of a rifle, and instead of a standard round, the soldier would load a special blank cartridge. When it fired, it pushed the grenade forward up to about 100 meters. But like with the flare pistol, firing it was anything but a comfortable experience due to the immense recoil, and trying to hit a weak spot of a moving tank with it was not the easiest thing in the world. The British, Americans, and Germans all had their many versions of rifle grenades, and not just for tanks. They used them also against infantry and fortifications where they were a bit more effective. So now look at this. If a rifle grenade couldn't be large enough to be effective, and on the other side you had towed smaller caliber anti-tank guns that were becoming obsolete against increasingly thicker armor, why not use this same concept and merge those two? The Germans created a couple of things like the Stielgranate 41. They took the obsolete 37mm anti-tank gun that had the nickname Door Knocker for how ineffective it became, and put a much larger shaped charge grenade on the end of the muzzle, which would be propelled by a blank cartridge. You can even see this thing showing up in Band of Brothers. It had quite good penetration, enough to threaten any tank of the time, but it needed to hit at a good angle. Doing so on a moving target with nowhere near the effective range or accuracy of an actual anti-tank gun was another story. Also, you'd have to carry a 37mm cannon with you, and although there were similar experiments on the same idea with other guns, it was eventually abandoned. Then, before the rocket-propelled concept was fully developed, there came another interesting attempt to throw an anti-tank warhead from the British. Unlike creative German names for weapons, this one was called simply PIAT, short for Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. Now this thing had a spigot, basically a steel rod that was powered by a strong spring inside. A grenade with a hollow tube sat on top, in which a small propellant charge was placed. The soldier would first cock the spring, which by the way wasn't an easy job, and then place the grenade on top. When the trigger was pulled, that rod would hit the grenade and launch it, while the small propellant charge gave it an additional push, so basically catapulting the grenade for up to 100 yards. Although the PIAT worked most of the time, it had its pros and cons, and soldiers had a bit of a love-hate relationship with it. For example, the recoil going into the shooter's shoulder was quite substantial, and, at least in theory, when the grenade was launched, the recoil from that charge should recock the spring, so the next grenade could be inserted and fired without the need for manual recocking. However, this wasn't always the case, and sometimes it wouldn't recock, so soldiers had to do it during a firefight, and the procedure required them to stand to be able to do this, which is not quite good when someone is shooting at you. Also, about a quarter of grenades were reported to be duds for some reason. Imagine hitting an enemy tank and just hearing a ding, with the charge bouncing off. The positive thing, however, was that there wasn't a back blast like in other weapons we're going to mention. So it wouldn't kick up smoke and dust and reveal the position of the shooter, and it could also be fired from enclosed space without setting you on fire. If you hit an enemy tank at the right angle, and the charge worked, it had a decent penetration of about 3 inches, so it could get the job done. Okay, so let's get serious now. Some of World War II's anti-tank weapons were quite effective, and they began the evolution that ended in these high-tech RPGs we have today. The American M1 Bazooka was the first practical mass-issued rocket-propelled anti-tank weapon. It went into combat in late 1942 with American units in North Africa, and quite significantly boosted soldiers' chances against tanks. For the first time, a 2-man team could carry something light and reliable enough to defeat enemy armor, especially the early lighter ones. The bazooka's tube was roughly 1.5 meters long, and the rocket inside was made of 3 main parts: a small solid fuel motor in the rear, stabilizing fins, and a hollow charge warhead in front. One soldier would aim and fire, while the other carried the rockets, loaded them from behind, and connected them to the electrical lead. Then, when the trigger was pressed, a small battery would send current to the igniter and activate the rocket. This was later changed to a better magneto trigger system because batteries were unreliable in battlefield conditions. Effective range was up to 150 meters if you could hit something precisely at that distance, and penetration was about the same as other charges of the time, enough to kill most tanks from the side. Bazookas saw heavy use by American troops, not just in the anti-tank role, but in all forms of fighting, and they were improved through several models throughout the war, introducing later larger 3.5-inch rockets as tank armor became thicker. Around the time America introduced the bazooka, the Germans were developing their Raketenwerfer 43. It was like a cannon, except it wasn't. It looked like a cute little gun, and even got a nickname, Pupken or Doll, but despite its look, it was actually a rocket launcher. It fired an 88mm rocket from a closed breech, and aiming was done not with the cranking wheels of a standard cannon, but with something like a machine gun with 2 handles. It also didn't have a recoil mechanism. The design was quite successful in testing, but then the Germans captured some bazookas from the Americans and were quite impressed, so much that they decided to copy it, and Germans being Germans, they made it even better. Even the name was better, Panzerschreck, meaning something like tank terror. The bazooka had a 60mm rocket, but the Panzerschreck had an 88mm one, resulting in more power. It could actually go through up to 200mm of armor, more than enough to kill any Allied tank throughout the war. Like the bazooka, it was also used to blast anything bothering you on the battlefield. The operator had this neat little shield for his face because of the backblast from the rocket leaving the barrel. So, while the Panzerschreck was a reloadable, reusable weapon, the Germans also tried to come up with a more portable, cheaper, disposable weapon as well. That would be the Panzerfaust. The steel tube contained propellant inside that launched the warhead in a high arc, so there had to be some compensation made in aiming, as it was a pretty low velocity and inaccurate weapon. It started with a smaller warhead, with an effective range of just 30 meters, if that, but it was improved throughout the war, with greater range and a more powerful warhead. The difference was that the Panzerfaust didn't need a trained two-man crew. It could be given to all soldiers and, with minimal training, used against enemy armor at close range. The range and accuracy were, however, its biggest problems, especially in the early models. A German soldier would have to come dangerously close to the enemy tank if he wanted to hit it, and expose himself completely while taking aim. But still, it was widely produced, with about 8 million units made throughout the war, and it accounted for a staggering number of knocked-out Allied tanks, especially later when the war shifted into defensive urban fights. The last models began to look like modern RPGs, introducing a straighter trajectory and higher velocity of rockets. However, the last model never got a chance to see combat. The Soviets captured them and used some of the ideas for their RPG-2 in the post-war years. So as you can see, these crude early forms of RPGs were just the beginning of a family tree that never really stopped evolving. We went from the Panzerfaust barely hitting a tank at 30 meters to things like the Javelin, N-Law, and others doing their own calculations, attacking from various angles, and delivering a warhead against which not a single modern tank could reliably protect itself. If you like how we talk about military history, you can check our channel for more. See you in the next one.